And while Uber and Lyft have added technology on top of the transportation industry, they haven't really changed the core of the transportation industry. It's still a passenger requesting a driver to come pick them up and drop them off, and they compensate that driver. So therefore, the same risks and the same liabilities still exist.
I don't mind competition as long as it is fair, and I don't see Uber and Lyft as fair competition.
I'm not particularly concerned with a fair and level playing field. I think I'm concerned with public safety, with the disparity in the rules on public safety and also on the environment. And I think if those rules were imposed the same for taxis and for everybody else, that the rest of it would more or less take care of itself.
One way to help better protect the public and level the playing field at the same time would be to require fingerprint-based background checks for all Uber and Lyft drivers prior to their employment.
Cab drivers have to be fingerprinted and run through the Department of Justice database, whereas TNC drivers don't have to do that.
Uber does a pretty good job of arguing that their background checks are just as good, but I find it hard to believe that any background check that you do that does not involve somebody's fingerprint is as good as taking their fingerprint, running it through a federal database, and finding out their entire history.
You've got the FBI, the NSA, every single security service uses fingerprinting. Interpol uses fingerprinting, and they all say that this is the major way to determine whether somebody's a criminal or not.
These other background checks that TNCs do, which are done through private companies, they don't have access to the same databases of criminal activity.
Uber and Lyft oppose fingerprint-based background checks for their drivers. But why?
The principle is to get as many vehicles out on the street, as many drivers out on the street for the longest period of time.
I'm not sure if it is cost or if it slows down the process of onboarding new drivers.
Uber and Lyft don't want any kind of barriers to their customers. They want drivers to be able to, while they're waiting in the grocery store line, sign up.
They simply have a corporate interest in getting people on the street as fast as possible with as few hassles as possible.
NBC did a pretty thorough investigation between three of their cities. I think it was Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco. And there was a lady with a 20-year rap sheet who got approved to be a driver within a month.
Fingerprint-based background checks could potentially help curb the number of new TNC drivers being onboarded, mitigating an oversaturated market that many drivers say exists, while implementing a gold standard in background checks. Another concern is that since Uber and Lyft want to onboard new drivers as seamlessly as possible and without any caps on their numbers, we should understand its environmental impacts.
I've been driving in San Francisco over 25 years, and just in the last 2 years I've seen this incredible traffic that I've never seen before in my career. And it coincides exactly with when the TNCs were allowed to operate with no restriction.
They've attacked politicians in Sacramento, in Houston, in Portland, in Seattle. Anybody that's attempted to put an environmental impact study on them.
You have drivers coming in to drive in San Francisco from LA or from San Diego or from Sacramento. So, they make claims that, we're taking cars off the road, but in fact, they're just adding more cars onto the road.
At the state Senate, where a hearing was held recently, one of the commissioners of the CPUC who was there to testify could not say how many TNC vehicles were operating in California, and a representative of Lyft could not or would not say how many vehicles Lyft had.
Thank you. How many vehicles do you have on the road?
I don't know the exact number. It's definitely, we have thousands of approved drivers.
What's your capacity working for Lyft again? You're the
VP of Government Relations.
Vice President of Government Relations,
Correct.
Okay. You don't know how many vehicles you have?
I can safely say that there are thousands of vehicles on the road. I don't know the
10,000?
At any given time, that's possible.
20,000?
I don't know that exactly.
You don't know how many vehicles are on the road of your own company?
I don't know exactly how many vehicles are on the road in the state of California at any given particular time. The usage of the Lyft platform can vary based on weather.
Do you know how high it can get? What's the highest?
What kind of regulatory scheme is this where you don't have the slightest idea of how many vehicles you're regulating?
Uber claims they've got, numbers vary, but in the neighborhood of 20 or 25,000 drivers in San Francisco alone. I mean, if you think of 20 or 25,000 drivers in a small city like San Francisco is not going to have an impact on congestion, is not going to have an impact on the roads, is not going to have an impact on emissions, then you're clueless.
We have the greenest taxi fleet in the country here, and San Francisco is proud not only of its taxi laws, but of its environmental initiatives across the board. I think regulation of numbers would be a significant portion of environmental regulations.
Although it's unclear how many TNC vehicles actually operate in California, what's certain is that they do not provide equal services to passengers in motorized wheelchairs.
People in wheelchairs should get the same service as anybody else without discrimination.
In San Francisco, it's required that a small percentage of the city's taxi fleet be wheelchair-accessible ramp vehicles in order to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Uber and Lyft don't provide wheelchair-accessible vehicles. One can assume it's due to lack of drivers volunteering to cover the higher costs.
The cost of a minivan with a wheelchair ramp on it is at minimum $30,000 to $35,000, right? The maintenance on these is much more expensive. It's almost double what the maintenance on a regular taxi cab is, or a regular vehicle is, because you have these hundreds of extra pounds that are on the vehicle, so it ruins the suspension, it ruins the transmission, it ruins the engine, it puts an additional strain on the car. So the maintenance is much more expensive.
They could certainly get a bunch of people to buy wheelchair accessible vehicles and simply subsidize that service.
Not having wheelchair accessible vehicles doesn't really give them a leg up on the taxi industry, but what they're doing is, by bringing down the taxi industry, they are destroying the service of wheelchair accessible vehicles for people who need them.
If other customers have to pay an extra dime or quarter or dollar, for their ride, and I'm absolutely certain it wouldn't be anywhere near a dollar, that's the way it should go. And these companies can do it, and they simply refuse to do it the way they refuse to do a lot of other things like fingerprint background checks.
Besides a lack of wheelchair accessible services, Uber and Lyft drivers generally do not obtain local business licenses for the cities that they do business in.
TNC drivers, they are using our streets, they are providing the very same service we do, and yet we pay a business license to the city and county of San Francisco, and they don't. I'd like our tax collector to look into that and demand every TNC driver to have a city business license.
Not only should every TNC driver obtain local business licenses, every TNC car should be marked with a permanent trade dress, not the removable ones they currently use.
There have been a couple of stories recently in San Francisco where passengers who requested Ubers or Lyfts were waiting for their car. They got into another car thinking that was their ride, that was their TNC vehicle, and they've gotten assaulted because it wasn't, and the guy takes them a couple of blocks and assaults the passenger.
At the airport, without permanent trade dress, they just take their trade dress off, and it makes it virtually impossible for any regulators or enforcement officers to enforce the law because they can't tell that they're TNC drivers.
Again, this all goes back to safety, right? And you don't have to be something as obvious or ostentatious as a taxi cab where the car is painted all kinds of crazy colors. But something permanently affixed to your windshield, right? Somewhere that somebody can identify this is an Uber car, right? Or affixed to the bumper, something along those lines where people can say, yeah, this is an Uber car.
Currently, Uber and Lyft are allowed to conduct their own vehicle inspections even if the person inspecting is not a licensed mechanic. California rules should require Uber and Lyft vehicles to be inspected only by a licensed mechanic or by a government agency such as the California Highway Patrol. Notice a lot of these cars are kind of brand new.
Yeah.
So you figure if they're these brand new Camrys and Priuses that are being leased out, I mean, do they really need to be inspected because you figure that these are tip-top conditions, and the reputation is they tend to be nicer.
Most of them are brand new, but I've seen I've seen vehicles that are late '90s model, early 2000s model cars that are on the road. You can't make an assumption that every car is going to be brand new and every car is going to be in tip-top shape. And even the ones that are brand new, if somebody's Ubering or Lyfting for 2 or 3 years, they're adding a lot of extra mileage on their car, and within a year or two, that car's now got 100,000 miles on it, depending on how often the driver drives. I mean, some of these guys drive full time, and when you drive full time, you put almost 100,000 miles a year on your car, which is a tremendous amount of mileage and a tremendous amount of wear and tear. And you don't know if that person is maintaining it right. You don't know if they're checking everything on a regular basis. So there has to be some neutral third party who does these inspections to make sure that the cars are at least serviceable and not going to put any passengers or any drivers in danger.
And last but not least, Uber and Lyft drivers need to obtain comprehensive insurance, as there are still insurance gaps, despite new laws having been passed in California around insurance requirements.
Taxi drivers have to have 100% full-time insurance, commercial insurance. These drivers are being allowed to have less than that, a part-time insurance, only being covered while the app is on. The problem with that is these drivers turn their app off regularly.
What happens when one of these drivers picks up somebody in the street, as we know that they sometimes do, or has a private client, and that is probably fairly widespread, because in the taxi industry, it happens all the time. You take somebody to the airport, you get into a conversation with them. Oh, I fly down to LA once a week, do some work down there. Oh, well, okay, why not give me a call next time you go? And then it becomes a regular gig. And for the TNC driver to do this, of course, it gives them, an airport ride, which is a good ride. It means that they don't have to pay the TNC their commission, which is a significant commission. And in every way, it's in their interest to do this. And it's certainly going on. I mean, the certainty is that it's going on, and we just don't know the extent of it. And when that happens, there's no insurance that's going to cover this.
In California, at least, there is insurance regulation, but the regulation is not comprehensive. And the insurance that these TNCs have is not comprehensive. There's still an insurance gap. And where that happens is, naturally, you're out there, you're using your TNC app, you're going to get people who come up to you and say, hey, just take me I need to go from A to B. Can you take me? I haven't hailed you with the app. And drivers will do that. Now, people can argue that they're not allowed to or they're not supposed to, but the reality of the situation is that's going to happen. So in this kind of a case, the TNC insurance doesn't apply. And that passenger and those drivers are driving uninsured.
I had a meeting, I guess the week before last, with one of the members of the CPUC, and the question was posed, well, if you think that there's a disparity in these regulations, maybe there should be fewer regulations on taxis. And I said, well, I would challenge anybody to point to the major taxi regulations that you want to dispense with. Do you want to get rid of fingerprint background checks for cab drivers? Do you want to get rid of driver training? Do you want to get rid of government inspections for vehicles? Do you want to get rid of the requirement, which is really a requirement of federal law, that we serve the disabled in the same way that we serve the rest of the population? So if you look at the taxi regulations, you may find something here or there that goes too far, that can be changed or tweaked, but the main core of regulation is important and necessary to keep.
Fingerprint-based background checks, environmental standards, protecting the rights of wheelchair passengers, requiring TNC drivers to get business licenses, permanent trade dress, vehicle inspections performed by a state-licensed mechanic or by a governmental agency, but not by a Lyft driver who isn't a mechanic, and comprehensive insurance that covers passengers even when TNC drivers break the rules and pick up street hails like a taxi. These are some of the most important safety measures that regulators and lawmakers need to enact in order to level the playing field. Right now, the playing field is heavily in favor of Uber and Lyft. Let's level the playing field and let everyone compete fairly. Thank you for watching.